So, Canadians were horrified with the murder of 28-year-old OPP Constable Greg Persala last December. They were horrified then, and they were outraged to discover that one of the murderers had a long history of violent crimes, including charges for assault against a peace officer. Yet he'd been released on bail. Randall McKenzie, he'd been in and out of prison for violent crimes. He was banned from possessing firearms. And of course, despite all that, he was given bail after being arrested for violent crimes and was in possession of a firearm. Due to Canada's lax criminal justice system, an innocent young police officer was murdered by a man who never should have been free to commit the crime. But why was Randall McKenzie repeatedly released despite the clear danger he presented to the public at large? Well, it all comes down to something called the Gladue Principles. Those principles were created through a Supreme Court case in 1999. Jamie Tanis Gladue stabbed her common-law husband to death, and it was ruled that her Indigenous background should be taken into consideration upon sentencing. The precedent and principles set were that lighter sentences should be given to Indigenous offenders by the courts whenever possible. The Canadian government just recently, in 2020, spent $49.3 million to support the further implementation of those principles in the system, spreading it through prosecutors and judges. During one of Mackenzie's parole hearings, it was stated that he had suffered the negative impacts of colonialism, and he believed his grandfather might even have attended a residential school. Yes, might have attended. And these things may or not may be true, but they don't have much bearing on whether or not Mackenzie would be safe to release. But that doesn't matter when it comes to the Gladue Principles. In a 2012 court case, another case went to the Supreme Court with a man named Manassi Ipili. Ipili, I could be mispronouncing it. He was a repeat violent sex offender, though. And the court reaffirmed, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, reaffirmed the Gladue Principles. Well, he'd been released, rearrested, and released and rearrested several times since then, a violent sexual offender. Now, last May in Calgary, a visually impaired senior citizen named Leonard Smith was randomly attacked while waiting for a train to go to work. His throat was cut ear to ear, and he was lucky to survive. The man who tried to kill Smith was a violent repeat offender named Bobby Crane. Crane's going to be free in about 14 months. And the judge ruled we must take into account the history of colonialism. Sound familiar? Last September, Miles Sanderson, I hate to even say that man's name, he murdered 11 people on the James Smith Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. He had 59 criminal convictions behind him, many of them violent. And still, he got nothing but short releases, or sentences. He was released, and it led to the deaths of 11 people. Now, studying the impacts of Indigenous policies and history is important when we're trying to find ways to prevent crime. Absolutely. Indigenous people are definitely very overrepresented in the prison system. The reason for that, though, is that Indigenous people are overrepresented when it comes to committing crimes. The system's failing them, and we need to understand why. But with all that said, it doesn't mean that Indigenous people convicted of violent crimes will be any less likely to reoffend upon release. And when we're going to consider bail and sentencing or parole of violent offenders, the safety of the public has to come first, no matter what the history might have been for the offender. Most sex offenders of any race experienced abuse themselves as children, and this is tragic, but it doesn't mean the offender is any less dangerous. The supposed intent of the Gladue Principles was to reduce the number of Indigenous people incarcerated. Well, it's been 20 years, more than 20 years, since the Gladue ruling, and Indigenous people are as overrepresented in the system as ever, if not actually more. So how long is it going to take to admit the principles have been a failure? How many more people have to die? Race-based policies in Canada created a terrible situation, and they created the situation that Indigenous people are living in. More race-based policies, though, aren't going to solve the problem. If we want to get to the root of why Indigenous people are disproportionately committing and being victims of crime, we should be looking at repealing the Indian Act and working away from our system of apartheid called reserves. There's clearly a problem in Canada. Indigenous people are the ones who are suffering from it. In the meantime, though, we need to put public safety first. We need to ensure dangerous offenders remain incarcerated no matter what their race and background are. The Gladue Principles have to go.
Here's a quick look at commodity prices in Lethbridge today. Cash barley is down another $4 at $4.43. Feed wheat is down $3 at $4.45, and corn is down $7 at $4.44 per metric ton. In the milling wheat markets, March Minneapolis futures dropped 12 3/4 cents to 906.5 per bushel, with local hard red spring bid for Jan-Feb movement at 11.55 per bushel. Looking at canola, nearby futures are lower $1.40 at 870.20 per ton, with delivered values for February movement at 19.50 per bushel. In the pulse markets, nearby red lentils are trading at 32.5 cents per pound, and yellow peas are higher 25 cents at $13 per bushel. And in the cattle markets, February live cattle added 62.5 cents at 157.48 per 100 weight. For more information on pricing or picked up options, give me a call, 403-394-1711. I'm Matt Busicum at Marketplace Commodities, accurate real-time marketing information and pricing options.
You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access.